the entire factory floor had gone silent. Hundreds of employees stood frozen as a grainy security video played across a giant screen mounted above the production area. The footage showed a tired maintenance worker sitting alone in a break room chair before his head slowly dropped forward from exhaustion. Just days earlier, that video had been used as evidence against him. His boss had publicly called him lazy, irresponsible, and unworthy of wearing the company uniform. The humiliation had happened in front of everyone. But now the screen showed something completely different. The footage continued beyond the moment nobody had bothered to watch. It showed the man leaving work after midnight, driving across town, entering a hospital, and spending the rest of the night sitting beside a hospital bed holding the hand of a little girl connected to heart monitors. One by one, employees lowered their heads. Several began wiping tears from their eyes. The same workers who had laughed during his humiliation now looked ashamed. And standing near the front of the room was the boss who had destroyed the man's reputation, realizing that the employee he had called lazy had actually been fighting the hardest battle of anyone in the building. Daniel Parker never expected life to become easy after his wife died, but he never imagined it would become this difficult either. 5 years earlier, he had buried the woman he loved and promised himself that no matter what happened, he would give their daughter Emma the best life he possibly could. Since that day, every decision he made revolved around her. He worked long hours as a maintenance technician at one of the largest manufacturing plants in the state, often volunteering for overtime shifts because every extra dollar mattered. Daniel wasn't the type of employee who sought recognition. He wasn't interested in promotions, office politics, or impressing management. He simply showed up, worked harder than anyone else, and went home to his daughter. Co-workers respected him because he was dependable. Machines broke down at all hours, and Daniel was always the person willing to stay late to fix them. If someone needed help, he offered it. If a new employee needed guidance, he provided it. For years, he earned a reputation as one of the most reliable workers in the company, but reliability couldn't protect him from the storm that was about to enter his life. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Daniel received a phone call from Emma's school. At first he assumed she had gotten into trouble or perhaps caught a cold, but the panic in the school nurse's voice immediately told him something was terribly wrong. Emma had collapsed during class and was being transported to the hospital. Daniel rushed there expecting doctors to reassure him that everything would be fine. Instead, he received news that shattered his world. Emma had a serious heart condition requiring extensive treatment and possibly surgery. Suddenly, his life became a cycle of hospital visits, medical tests, specialist appointments, insurance paperwork, and impossible financial decisions. During the day, he worked 12-hour shifts. At night, he sat beside Emma's hospital bed. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. There were nights when he managed only 2 or 3 hours before returning to work. Some mornings he drove directly from the hospital to the factory without ever seeing his own home. Yet despite the exhaustion, he refused to complain because every minute he spent working helped pay for the care keeping his daughter alive. As weeks turned into months, the strain became impossible to hide. Dark circles formed beneath Daniel's eyes. His shoulders sagged from fatigue. Co-workers noticed him skipping lunch breaks and drinking coffee simply to stay awake. Many quietly offered support, but Daniel rarely discussed his personal struggles because he didn't want sympathy. Unfortunately, not everyone viewed his exhaustion with compassion. The plant's operations manager, Richard Collins, had built his career on strict discipline and relentless productivity standards. Richard believed success came from pushing people harder than they believed possible. While many executives admired his results, employees feared his temper. He viewed personal problems as distractions and often reminded supervisors that business came before emotions. When Richard noticed Daniel's declining energy, he didn't ask questions. Instead, he assumed the worst. He convinced himself that Daniel had become complacent. Every time he saw the exhausted father moving a little slower than usual, it reinforced his belief that the once reliable employee was losing his work ethic. Rather than investigating the truth, Richard created a story in his own mind and treated that story as fact. The breaking point arrived after one of the worst weeks of Daniel's life. Emma's condition had suddenly deteriorated, forcing doctors to admit her for additional monitoring. Daniel spent 3 consecutive nights sleeping in an uncomfortable hospital chair while trying to reassure his frightened daughter that everything would be okay. During the day, he continued reporting to work because missing shifts wasn't financially possible. By Friday afternoon, his body had reached its limit. While waiting for diagnostic results on a malfunctioning production machine, Daniel sat briefly inside a maintenance office. His intention was to rest his eyes for a few seconds before returning to work. Instead, exhaustion overwhelmed him. Moments later, Richard Collins walked into the room and found him asleep. What happened next became the most humiliating moment of Daniel's life. Rather than speaking privately, Richard exploded with anger. He began shouting loud enough for nearby employees to hear. Workers stopped what they were doing and gathered around. The crowd grew larger with every passing minute. Richard accused Daniel of stealing company time, setting a terrible example and becoming dead weight. The more people watched, the more dramatic Richard became. He mocked Daniel's dedication, questioned his character, and publicly dismantled years of hard-earned respect in front of everyone. Daniel stood there listening as his reputation was torn apart. Every instinct told him to explain what was happening in his life, but pride and exhaustion kept him silent. He didn't want to discuss Emma's illness in front of a crowd. He didn't want pity. He certainly didn't want his daughter becoming workplace gossip. So he absorbed every insult without defending himself. Some employees looked uncomfortable. Others exchanged whispers. A few even laughed nervously, afraid to challenge management. Richard interpreted Daniel's silence as guilt and continued his public lecture until he finally suspended him without pay. The announcement hit harder than any insult. Daniel immediately thought about hospital bills, medication costs, and upcoming treatments. Losing income could affect everything. Yet even then, he said nothing. He gathered his tools, walked past the staring employees, and left the building. That evening he returned to the hospital and sat beside Emma's bed pretending everything was normal. She noticed the sadness in his eyes almost instantly, but Daniel forced a smile and reassured her that he was simply tired. As he held her hand through another sleepless night, he quietly wondered how he would keep their lives from falling apart. What Richard didn't know was that dozens of employees were deeply disturbed by what they had witnessed. Several supervisors felt the punishment was excessive. Others knew Daniel's character well enough to believe there had to be an explanation. The incident eventually reached the ears of Michael Reynolds, the company's owner. Unlike Richard, Michael spent little time on the factory floor, but he cared deeply about company culture and employee welfare. When he heard that one of the company's most respected workers had been publicly humiliated, something didn't sit right with him. He began asking questions. The answers surprised him. Supervisor after supervisor described Daniel as one of the most dependable employees in the company's history. Attendance records showed years of exceptional performance. Overtime reports revealed that he routinely worked more hours than almost anyone else. Curious, Michael dug deeper. Eventually, he learned about Emma's medical condition and the countless nights Daniel had spent at the hospital. Suddenly, the story changed completely. What appeared to be negligence was actually the result of extraordinary sacrifice. The employee Richard had labeled lazy was a father pushing himself beyond human limits to save his daughter. Furious that such an injustice had occurred under his leadership, Michael launched a full review of the incident. Security footage, employee statements, attendance records, and hospital documentation painted a heartbreaking picture. Daniel wasn't failing because he lacked discipline. He was succeeding despite carrying an unimaginable burden. Determined to make things right, Michael organized a mandatory company meeting attended by every employee. Richard arrived expecting another discussion about productivity metrics. Instead, he walked into the most uncomfortable day of his career. Michael addressed the crowd and began presenting the evidence. The giant screen displayed months of footage showing Daniel arriving early, staying late, helping coworkers, and working through obvious exhaustion. Then the presentation shifted to the hospital visits. Images showed the reality Daniel had hidden from everyone. Employees watched him sitting beside Emma during long nights, comforting her during procedures, and returning to work after barely sleeping. The room became emotional. Tears appeared. Heads lowered. For the first time, everyone saw the complete story. Michael then turned toward Richard and declared that leadership without compassion becomes cruelty. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech. The final surprise came moments later when Daniel entered the building believing he had been invited to discuss his suspension. Instead, he was greeted by a standing ovation from hundreds of employees. The applause thundered across the factory floor. Workers who had once stood silently during his humiliation now rose to their feet in support. Michael publicly apologized on behalf of the company and immediately reinstated Daniel with full pay. Then he announced that the company would cover a significant portion of Emma's medical expenses. Before Daniel could process the news, another revelation followed. Employees had voluntarily organized a fundraising campaign after learning about Emma's condition. Their original goal had been $20,000. They had raised more than $250,000. Daniel stared at the number in disbelief. Years of worry, fear, and uncertainty suddenly collided with overwhelming gratitude. Tears filled his eyes as he looked around the room at the people supporting him. The same workplace that had become the source of his greatest humiliation had transformed into the source of his greatest hope. Even Richard stepped forward and offered a sincere public apology, admitting that he had judged a man without knowing his story. A few months later, Emma underwent successful surgery. The procedure that once seemed financially impossible became reality because an entire community chose compassion over judgment. Her recovery was slow but steady, and eventually she returned home healthy enough to run, laugh, and enjoy life again. Daniel never forgot what happened during those difficult months. He remembered the pain of being misunderstood, but he also remembered the kindness that followed. More importantly, the experience changed the entire company. Managers received additional leadership training focused on empathy and communication. Employees became more supportive of one another. And Richard Collins never again assumed he knew what someone was going through based solely on appearances. The lesson spread far beyond the factory walls. Every person carries battles invisible to the outside world. The coworker who seems distracted may be caring for a sick child. The employee who looks exhausted may be sacrificing everything for someone they love. Before judging someone, take a moment to understand their story. You might discover that what appears to be weakness is actually incredible strength. If this story touched your heart, remember to treat people with kindness because you never know what they are facing behind closed doors. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment with the lesson that stood out most to you.